The Price of Desire. In the grand estate of Harrington Manor, David Harrington sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the same one he'd bought years ago when his company first turned profitable. Now, in his early 50s, with countless successful ventures under his belt, David should have felt invincible. Yet as he flipped through the stack of divorce papers, a heavy chill settled over him. Across from him sat his wife, Elise, who had shared every triumph and trial of his journey from struggling entrepreneur to billionaire. Her once youthful face now held signs of both joy and hardship, and her eyes, once bright with adoration, were dim, though they still searched his face with a silent plea. David avoided her gaze. He'd already convinced himself that this was necessary, that the spark in their marriage had been lost to the relentless demands of life, and that he had the right to seek out something new. "Is this truly what you want, David?" Elise's voice was soft but unyielding. "Yes," he replied, his tone rehearsed, lacking any hint of remorse. He told himself that it was for the best. He was no longer the man Elise had married, the man who had taken risks, worked tirelessly, and believed in his shared dream. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that dream, and with it, he believed he had lost the connection that bound him to Elise. Now he was sure that Samantha, his new young partner, held the key to rekindling his own zest for life. Without another word, Elise signed the papers. She didn't cry, beg, or plead. Instead, she seemed to shrink within herself, her shoulders drooping with the weight of the life she was about to leave behind. As she left, David didn't realize the depth of the chasm he was opening. He didn't think to check on her or wonder how she would cope without him. Elise, in his mind, would move on as he planned to do, quickly and painlessly. 2 years passed. David's life had transformed into something straight out of a magazine spread. With Samantha by his side, he'd attended gala after gala, traveled the world, and indulged in a lifestyle of luxury that few could even imagine. But beneath the surface of his glittering life, David felt an itch he couldn't quite scratch, a dissatisfaction that crept up in the quiet moments when he was alone. Samantha, once vibrant and free-spirited, had grown increasingly demanding. She wanted more vacations, more jewelry, more of everything. It wasn't enough to simply be Mrs. Harrington. She wanted the world to know she was Mrs. Harrington. David's work life began to consume him once more as he chased deal after deal to sustain Samantha's insatiable appetite for the high life. But each deal came with higher stakes, and his once rock-solid confidence started to crack under the pressure. David convinced himself that this was just the price of success, and that he could manage it. After all, he was still one of the most respected names in business, and Samantha was the perfect trophy for his achievements. But as their days turned into endless routines of lavish parties and public appearances, he started to feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. One afternoon, as David made his way downtown for yet another high-stakes meeting, something caught his eye in a nearby park. A familiar figure was sitting on a bench, surrounded by children who were laughing and playing around her. David slowed down, his heart giving an unexpected jolt as he recognized Elise. Time seemed to have softened her rather than worn her down. She looked at peace, her face radiant with a quiet joy he hadn't seen in years. But what truly stopped him in his tracks were the children around her. There were 4 of them, each with a pair of striking blue eyes that mirrored his own. They were young, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, quadruplets who looked so much like him that it sent a chill down his spine. David's mind raced. Could it be possible? Had Elise moved on, built a new life without him, a life that included children who shared his own features? His throat tightened as he took in the scene, the painful realization dawning on him that he might have left behind more than just a marriage. With a growing sense of dread and confusion, he felt the weight of choices he hadn't fully understood. Later that evening, David found himself at the door of a modest townhouse on the far side of the city. His mind was spinning as he rang the doorbell, half expecting Elise to refuse to speak with him. But when she opened the door, she looked at him with an expression of calm resilience, a look he hadn't seen before. She seemed stronger, more composed, and the bitterness he'd expected wasn't there. Elise, those children. Are they? David stumbled over his words, unable to finish the question that had been tormenting him since he'd seen her. She met his eyes, unflinching. Yes, David. They're yours. Our children. Her voice was steady, filled with a quiet dignity. David felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. His mind swam with questions, anger, regret. Why didn't you tell me? He demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. How could you keep something like this from me? Elise looked at him, the faintest hint of sadness in her expression. Because, David, you didn't care enough to ask. You walked out of my life without a second glance, and by the time I found out I was pregnant, you were already lost in your new world. I chose to raise them alone, because I couldn't bear to ask for something you had so easily thrown away. David felt a surge of emotions, guilt, shame, anger. His pride bristled, but deep down, he knew Elise was right. He had left without looking back, thinking only of himself and his desires, never once considering that Elise might have had something far more precious to share with him. As he stood there, feeling the weight of his mistakes press down on him, David understood for the first time the true cost of his choices. The life he'd left behind was far richer than the one he had chosen, and now, facing Elise and the children he had never known, he felt a hollowness that his wealth could never fill. Elise sighed, breaking the silence. You don't get to come into their lives now just because you're ready. I've given them everything they needed, David. They know love. They know security. They don't need someone who abandoned them before they were even born. As her words sunk in, David's mind reeled, the stark reality of his actions settling in with a harsh finality. He had chosen a life of luxury, thrill, and ambition over the family that had once been his world, and now he faced the consequences. The weight of regret. David staggered away from Elise's door, his mind a storm of confusion and regret. He stumbled down the narrow steps of her modest townhouse, feeling more disoriented than he had in years. The image of Elise standing there with such calm strength, and the memory of those children, their children, whirled through his mind like a relentless tide. His chest tightened as he realized he had lost something far more valuable than anything he had gained. Back in his penthouse, David poured himself a glass of scotch, but the drink offered no comfort. The lavish suite, with its expensive decor and city views, now felt cold and lifeless. The quiet here was deafening, each corner of the room a reminder of the life he had traded for fleeting satisfaction. As he sat down, his phone buzzed. It was Samantha, texting from a luxury resort, where she'd gone on a retreat with her friends. Her message was brief and laced with irritation. Just checking if you're actually going to make it to Bali next week. Thought you'd be serious about this vacation for once. If not, I'll make my own plans. David groaned, tossing the phone aside. Samantha's demands were constant, and no matter what he did, it never seemed enough. What had once seemed like excitement and vitality in her now felt like a relentless drive for more trips, more shopping, more of his attention. The thrill he had once craved now left him empty. But nothing could compare to the emptiness he felt thinking about Elise and the children he'd never known. He'd walked out of that townhouse, his mind filled with questions he was too ashamed to ask. The reality was undeniable. He had walked away without ever realizing what he was leaving behind. How had he been so blind? The next day, David returned to his office, but even there, the weight of his newfound awareness wouldn't leave him. His work no longer held the satisfaction it once did, and for the first time, he could feel the cracks in his empire. Sales had been slipping, investors were growing anxious, and the board had started whispering about his focus, or lack thereof. David had thrown himself into his work, hoping to keep up the lifestyle he and Samantha had built, but now even that seemed meaningless. The day dragged on in meetings and empty calls, his mind drifting repeatedly to those 4 young faces. They had been so full of life, so innocent. The realization that they had never known him, never had him there to share in their laughter, their first steps, their triumphs, cut deeper than he thought possible. They were his children, and he'd abandoned them without a second thought. By the end of the day, he couldn't take it anymore. He found himself back in his car, parked outside Elise's home. He wasn't sure what he'd say or even if she'd let him in, but he couldn't let it go. He needed to see them, to know them, to understand what he had given up. Gathering his courage, he walked up to her door and knocked. After a long pause, Elise answered. Her expression was guarded, her eyes reflecting both wariness and the strength he had failed to appreciate during their years together. "What do you want, David?" she asked, her voice calm yet resolute. David hesitated, his pride and guilt clashing within him. I want to know them. Elise, I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try." Elise sighed, looking at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. "David, you can't just walk in and expect everything to be okay. You left when they needed you the most. I did everything on my own, every late night, every emergency, every question they asked about where their father was. I had to tell them you didn't want to be part of our lives." The words pierced him deeply. He had always convinced himself that Elise would be fine, that she was strong enough to handle whatever came her way. But he'd never considered what it would mean for her to raise 4 children alone, to carry the weight of his absence. "Please," he said, his voice nearly breaking. "I know I made mistakes, terrible ones. I just want a chance to make it right." Elise's face softened slightly, though the sadness in her eyes remained. She took a deep breath, glancing back into the house. "It's not that simple, David. They're just children. They don't understand why you left, and they don't need the confusion of you coming and going. If you're really serious, then you'll have to prove it." David nodded, feeling a flicker of hope amidst his guilt. "I'll do whatever it takes." Elise gave him a long, considering look. "All right," she said finally. "I'll let you see them. But if you hurt them or break their trust, I won't give you another chance." David's first encounter with his children was more humbling than he could have imagined. Elise allowed him to join them for an afternoon in the park, where the kids could feel safe and comfortable. The children were a whirlwind of energy, running from the swings to the slides, their laughter filling the air. Watching them, David felt an ache that he hadn't known before, a yearning to be part of their lives. One of the boys, who Elise had introduced as Noah, approached him shyly, clutching a small toy truck. David smiled, crouching down to meet him at eye level. "Do you like trucks?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Noah nodded, studying him with wide eyes. "Mom says you used to drive a really big car. Is that true?" David chuckled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Yes, I did. And maybe one day you can ride in it too." Noah's eyes sparkled with excitement, but he quickly ran off to join his siblings, leaving David standing there, watching. He felt an overwhelming desire to be the father they deserved, but he also knew that regaining their trust would take more than a few park visits. Over the next few weeks, David began to spend more time with the children, each visit revealing just how much he had missed. He marveled at their curiosity, their boundless energy, and the way they adored Elise. She was their anchor, the person they trusted above all else, and it made him painfully aware of his own failings. But David's life outside these visits began to crumble. The board of his company grew impatient with his distractions, and his lack of focus started to impact the company's bottom line. Investors were withdrawing, and rumors circulated about his declining leadership. Even Samantha seemed more distant, her texts brief and cold. She was already hinting at her dissatisfaction, and David knew that without his wealth, she would leave. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, he felt an odd sense of calm whenever he was with his children. Their laughter reminded him of simpler times, of moments when life had been about more than just deals and status. He found himself craving their innocence and joy, something he had traded long ago for a hollow dream of luxury. But Elise remained firm in her boundaries. She was grateful for his involvement, but she made it clear that the children came first. "They're my world, David, she told him one evening after he brought them home. I won't let anything or anyone disrupt their happiness, not even you. David nodded, understanding more than ever the depth of her love and sacrifice. He felt a pang of jealousy, realizing that she had found something he could never buy or recreate. He had sacrificed love, family, and true joy for ambition, and now he was left with the wreckage of his own making. The toll of his choices weighed on him heavily. At night, he lay awake, haunted by the image of his children's innocent faces and Elise's steady gaze. The mansion he once cherished felt empty, the rooms echoing with memories of what could have been. Even Samantha's presence brought him no comfort. Her shallow demands only amplified his loneliness. In those quiet, sleepless nights, David felt himself coming to a painful realization. He had lost not just his family, but a part of himself. The emptiness he had tried to fill with wealth and ambition now felt like a prison, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to escape it. Shattered reflections. The months that followed tested David in ways he had never anticipated. The thrill of business success that had once fueled him now felt hollow and meaningless. His days were filled with work, yet he found himself increasingly restless, his mind drifting to his children and the life he had neglected. Each visit with them chipped away at his defenses, uncovering a vulnerability he buried long ago. David's finances, which had once seemed invincible, now teetered on the edge of collapse. His company, Harrington Enterprises, had hit turbulent times. Once loyal investors were pulling out, citing his lack of focus and the questionable decisions he'd made in recent months. It was clear to everyone, especially David, that he was no longer the driven mogul he once had been. Meetings ended with whispers among the board members, and there was talk of replacing him as CEO, a thought that sent shivers down his spine. His relationship with Samantha, too, was unraveling. She was growing impatient, her glitzy lifestyle increasingly difficult to maintain with David's finances in decline. Their once glamorous evenings turned into tense dinners, each conversation an argument about money, her demands becoming more insistent. David knew it was only a matter of time before Samantha walked out of his life, just as he had once walked out of Elise's. The irony was bitter, and he wondered how he had failed to see this coming. One evening, after another argument with Samantha, David decided to visit Elise and the children. He was desperate for something real, something that reminded him of a life not built on facades. Elise met him at the door, her expression one of both caution and compassion. "You're here late, David," she said softly, closing the door quietly behind her so the children wouldn't be disturbed. David hesitated, struggling to find the words to explain his turmoil. "I needed to see them," he admitted, his voice unsteady. "They're the only part of my life that feels worthwhile." Elisa's expression softened, though her eyes held a wary sadness. "David, they're just beginning to trust you. Don't let them down now." He nodded, guilt tightening in his chest. He knew he had failed his family once, but he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them again. "I won't," he promised, though the weight of that commitment felt daunting. Elise studied him for a moment, as though searching for the truth in his words. "They adore you, David," she said quietly, "but they also need stability, and I can't let them get hurt." Her words stung, a painful reminder of his past failures. He had forfeited the stability of family for the thrill of something fleeting, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life he had shattered. The following week brought an unexpected blow. David arrived at his office only to find his assistant standing nervously by the door, her face pale. "Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice tense, "the board has called an emergency meeting." David frowned, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. He entered the boardroom, greeted by the cold, impassive faces of his colleagues. The chairman, a steely-eyed man named Charles, cleared his throat. "David, we've decided it's time to consider new leadership," Charles began, his tone devoid of sympathy. "The company's financial health has been declining, and frankly, we're concerned about your recent distractions." David's stomach churned. He had built this company from the ground up, and now it was being stripped from him. "I can fix this," he insisted, his voice tinged with desperation. "I just need more time." But the board members exchanged doubtful glances. It was clear that his plea was falling on deaf ears. Charles' expression softened only slightly as he delivered the final blow. "David, take this as a leave of absence. Reflect on what's important. Perhaps in time, we can reconsider." As he left the office that day, the weight of defeat pressed heavily upon him. He had spent his life building an empire, only to watch it crumble. The reality was clear. Without the company, without the wealth, he was left with nothing but memories of a life he had destroyed. That night, David returned to the empty penthouse, the silence oppressive. He poured himself a glass of scotch, hoping to drown the pain. But the alcohol did little to numb him. The faces of his children haunted him, their innocent smiles, their laughter, moments he had missed in pursuit of a hollow dream. He had gained everything, only to realize it meant nothing without family. As he sat there, a thought gnawed at him, persistent and uncomfortable. He had been given a second chance with his children, but he knew he couldn't keep up this facade forever. His finances were dwindling, his reputation was tarnished, and even his luxurious penthouse was at risk of being repossessed. He was living on borrowed time. In a moment of clarity, David decided to take a drastic step. The next morning, he called Elise. She answered cautiously, her voice wary. "David, I need to talk to you," he said, the urgency in his voice surprising even himself. "Not just about the kids, about everything." Elise agreed to meet him at a small cafe, far from the opulence of his usual haunts. When she arrived, David was already seated, looking more worn than she had ever seen him. His once stylish suit was wrinkled, his face haggard. "Elise," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. I was selfish, blind to what truly mattered. And now I'm losing everything." She listened in silence, her gaze steady. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to be a part of their lives. I want to change, to be better, for them, and for myself." Elise took a deep breath, considering his words. "David, it's not about forgiveness," she said gently. "It's about responsibility. You walked away once, and that hurt them. I can't let that happen again." David nodded, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "I know, and I'm prepared to do whatever it takes." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Actions speak louder than words, David. If you truly want to be in their lives, then show them. Show me." Over the next few months, David worked to rebuild the trust he had lost. He sold his penthouse, trading it for a modest apartment closer to Elise's neighborhood. The luxury cars, designer suits, and extravagant possessions were all sold off, the funds redirected toward securing a future for his children. He found a job as a consultant for a smaller firm, a far cry from his former position, but it allowed him the flexibility to be present in his children's lives. Each day, he made time to visit them, joining them for park outings, helping with their homework, and learning about the little things he'd missed. It was humbling, watching as they grew to accept him, their initial shyness giving way to excitement when he arrived. He cherished these moments, understanding now what he had once taken for granted. One rainy afternoon, as he sat with Elise in her living room while the children played, he turned to her, his expression serious. "Elise, I know I have no right to ask this," he began, his voice tentative. "But do you think I could ever earn back the family I lost?" Elise looked at him, her expression thoughtful. She had seen the changes in him, had witnessed his dedication, his newfound humility. She knew he was no longer the same man who had walked out of her life, blinded by ambition and selfishness. "David," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength, "you're already part of their lives. That's what matters. But it'll take time. For them, And for me. David nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and hope. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he was willing to walk it, no matter how long it took. That evening, as he left Elise's home, David felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace. He had lost nearly everything, but he had gained a chance to rebuild what mattered most. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and sacrifices, but he knew he wouldn't walk it alone. For the first time in years, David felt like he was truly living. The empire he had once built was gone, but in its place, he was building something far more valuable, a life filled with love, integrity, and purpose. As he walked away from Elise's home, the rain falling gently around him, David felt a sense of redemption. The journey he had begun was one of healing, and though he had a long way to go, he was no longer afraid. He had found his way back to the family he had lost, and he would cherish every moment he had with them, determined never to lose sight of what truly mattered again. Trials of redemption. David's life had taken on a new rhythm, one of simplicity and purpose, though not without challenges. Gone were the days of power lunches, extravagant trips, and endless board meetings. Now his calendar was filled with soccer games, school events, and quiet evenings helping his children with homework. With each passing day, he felt himself transforming, shedding layers of his former self and embracing the life he had once abandoned. Yet, despite his efforts, David was painfully aware that his past mistakes continued to cast a shadow over his present. He could see it in the way Elise held herself when he was around, a mix of caution and hesitation. She had softened toward him, no longer the guarded woman who had greeted him at her door months before, but there remained a distance, a barrier he wasn't sure he could ever cross. And then there were his children. While they were growing more comfortable with him, laughing at his jokes, and running into his arms at the park, David could see that a part of them was still uncertain. They were young, innocent, and filled with questions about where he had been, questions he didn't know how to answer. One day, while walking with his youngest daughter, Ava, she looked up at him, her small hand wrapped around his finger. "Daddy," she asked, her eyes filled with curiosity, "why did you go away before?" David felt his throat tighten, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze. "I made a big mistake, Ava," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I thought I was doing what was right, but I was wrong. And I'm so sorry that I wasn't here when you needed me." Ava studied him, her young mind processing his words. After a long pause, she nodded, accepting his answer with the innocence only a child could offer. She wrapped her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. David closed his eyes, holding her close, feeling both the sweetness and the sadness of the moment. He knew he had been given a precious chance to be in his children's lives, but he also understood that forgiveness would be a journey, one he would have to walk with patience and humility. Meanwhile, his relationship with Elise grew more complex. They saw each other often, as co-parents sharing in the daily responsibilities of raising 4 young children. They spoke easily about the kids, laughing over their quirks, planning activities, and discussing their future. But there were boundaries, unspoken lines that neither of them dared to cross. She had built a life of her own, one that no longer revolved around him, and he respected that. Yet, as time passed, he found himself yearning to bridge the gap between them, to become more than just the man who had returned out of guilt. One evening, as they prepared for a school fundraiser, David found himself alone with Elise in her kitchen. She was arranging a tray of cupcakes, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her, noting the gentle lines that creased her forehead, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She was beautiful in a way that made his heart ache, a reminder of all he had lost. "Let me help with those," he offered, stepping forward. She glanced up, a small smile gracing her lips. "All right, but don't mess them up," she teased, handing him the tray. They worked side by side, exchanging quiet laughter as he tried, and failed, to ice the cupcakes as neatly as she did. It was a simple moment, one that felt remarkably like old times. David's heart ached with a bittersweet longing as he realized just how much he missed these small, everyday moments with her. "Thank you, Elise," he said suddenly, his voice soft. She looked up, her eyes questioning. "For letting me back into their lives, for giving me a chance." Elise's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "David, I didn't do it for you. I did it for them. They deserve to know you, and you deserve the chance to be their father. But it's not easy for any of us." Her voice held a quiet strength, a reminder of the pain she had endured alone. He nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He wanted to say more, to tell her how much he had changed, how much he wanted to make things right. But he knew that words alone would never be enough. She had given him a second chance, but it was one he would have to earn every single day. As David's bond with his children deepened, he found himself facing another unexpected challenge: his financial situation. His consulting job provided enough to cover his modest apartment and basic expenses, but it was a far cry from the wealth he had once taken for granted. He struggled to adjust, finding that the simple joys of life, such as taking his children to a movie or buying them new clothes, now required careful budgeting. For the first time, he was learning the value of money and the importance of providing in ways that went beyond material wealth. One afternoon, as he watched his children playing at the park, he received a call from Samantha. Her voice was sharp, laced with impatience. "David, we need to talk," she began. "I'm tired of this. You're barely making anything now, and I didn't sign up for a life of penny pinching. I want a real future, with someone who can actually provide." David sighed, the sting of her words familiar but still painful. He had known this day would come, had sensed it in her growing distance and disinterest. "I understand, Samantha," he replied calmly. "I can't give you the life I once could, and I won't pretend otherwise." There was a pause, then a sigh of exasperation on her end. "So that's it?" she asked, her tone accusing. "That's it," he confirmed, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time, he realized he was no longer shackled to the image he had once tried to uphold. Samantha had been a part of his life that represented the man he used to be, and he no longer felt bound by those shallow aspirations. As he ended the call, he looked up to see Elise watching him from across the park, her expression unreadable. She had seen the conversation, and he could tell she understood what had happened. "Are you all right?" she asked gently as he walked over. He nodded, a bittersweet smile on his face. "Yes, I think I am." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the children play. The air between them felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. In that moment, David realized that he didn't need the wealth, the status, or the validation that had once driven him. He had found something far more valuable: a connection to his family, to the simple, meaningful moments that he had once overlooked. Weeks turned into months, and David continued to rebuild his life piece by piece. His relationship with Elise remained complex, but they had developed a rhythm, a balance that allowed them to co-parent with respect and understanding. His bond with his children grew stronger, each moment spent with them a reminder of the love he had once taken for granted. But even as he settled into this new life, David knew that his journey was far from over. He still faced the consequences of his past, the damage he had inflicted on those he loved. And while he had regained a place in his children's lives, he knew that healing the wounds of his marriage would require more than time and patience. It would require true redemption. One evening, as he tucked his children into bed, his oldest son, Liam, looked up at him with a serious expression. "Dad," he said quietly, "are you going to stay this time?" David's heart ached at the question. He could hear the uncertainty, the lingering doubt in Liam's voice. He knelt beside his son, meeting his gaze. "Yes, Liam. I'm here to stay. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Liam nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "Good. I like it when you're here." David kissed his forehead, the simple act filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He knew that he had a long way to go, that he still had to prove himself worthy of their love and trust. But for the first time, he felt a quiet confidence, a belief that he could build a life filled with meaning and purpose. As he left his children's room, he found Elise waiting for him in the hallway. She looked at him, her eyes softening with a mixture of warmth and something else, something he dared not name. "You're doing well, David," she said softly. "The kids, they're happy. And that's all I ever wanted." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Elise, for giving me this chance." They stood in silence, the unspoken words hanging between them. For now, it was enough. He didn't need forgiveness or promises, only the quiet assurance that he was on the right path. As he left her home that night, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come full circle, rediscovering the things that truly mattered. The journey had been painful, filled with regret and sacrifice, but he was finally beginning to understand the meaning of love, family, and redemption. Bonds tested. David's life had transformed in ways he could hardly have imagined. What had started as an attempt to make amends with his family had blossomed into a life richer and more meaningful than anything he had known before. He felt the warmth of his children's love, the subtle shifts in Elise's gaze that told him she saw the changes in him. But despite his progress, David knew he was not yet free of the consequences of his past. Old wounds still lingered, both in his family and within himself. One cold autumn evening, as David prepared for another modest dinner in his small apartment, his phone rang. The name on the screen made his stomach twist. Charles, the chairman of the board at Harrington Enterprises. He hadn't heard from anyone at the company since he'd been ousted, and he'd assumed they'd moved on without him. Curiosity and anxiety swirled as he answered. "David, it's been a while," Charles said, his voice cool and businesslike. "We've been reviewing the company's direction, and, well, we'd like to offer you a proposal." David's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of proposal?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "A comeback," Charles replied. "Harrington Enterprises hasn't been the same without your leadership. The new team lacks the vision you brought. We're proposing a return, not as CEO, but as an advisory partner, guiding us back on track. You'd be compensated well." David's mind raced. The thought of returning to his company, even in an advisory role, stirred memories of the power, respect, and financial security he had once held. But alongside the temptation was a heaviness, a memory of the life he had lost chasing after success. He thought of his children, of the stability they had found with him in their lives, and of the fragile bond he was still working to rebuild. "Charles, I need some time to think about it," he said, his voice carefully measured. "Of course," Charles replied smoothly. "We'd expect nothing less from you." After the call ended, David sank onto his couch, feeling the weight of the offer settle over him. A chance to return to the business world, to the life he had once thrived in. It was enticing, almost intoxicating. But he knew that to return to that life would mean sacrificing time with his family, slipping back into a world that had once consumed him. The decision loomed, bringing a sense of dread he couldn't ignore. In the following days, David threw himself into his role as a father, hoping that spending time with his children would provide clarity. He took them to their soccer games, helped with school projects, and found joy in the simple moments of their lives. But the weight of Charles' offer remained, tugging at him, whispering of the life he could reclaim. Elise noticed his distraction one evening as he picked up the kids. After they'd settled into playing in the living room, she gestured for him to step outside. The cool evening air was refreshing, but her gaze was sharp, piercing through the facade he had tried to maintain. "You're distracted, David," she said, her tone gentle but probing. "What's going on?" He hesitated, unsure of how to explain the conflict within him. "The company reached out," he said finally. "They want me back. Not as CEO, but as an advisor." Elisa's expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and concern. "And are you considering it?" "I don't know," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "Part of me misses that world, the work, the energy. But another part of me knows that going back means risking everything I've rebuilt here. I don't want to lose you and the kids." Elise regarded him thoughtfully. "David, this isn't about what I want. This is about what you want, and what you're willing to give up to get it. If you decide to go back, just make sure it's for the right reasons." Her words lingered with him long after he left, filling him with a sense of unease. He had fought so hard to regain his family's trust, to build a new life grounded in love and connection. Was he willing to throw it all away for the hollow promises of wealth and status? A few days later, David received another call, this time from Liam's school. The principal's voice was urgent, informing him that Liam had been involved in a fight with another student. Heart pounding, David drove to the school, dreading what he might find. When he arrived, he was taken to the principal's office, where Liam sat, his face bruised, his shoulders slumped. David's heart ached at the sight of his son, and he rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. "Liam, what happened?" he asked gently. Liam looked away, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "The other kids, they were saying things about you," he muttered. "About how you left us, and that you only came back because you had no money." David felt a surge of emotions, anger, guilt, and a fierce protectiveness for his son. He looked to the principal, who explained that Liam had punched a boy who had taunted him about his father's past. As the words sank in, David realized the depth of his son's pain, the lingering wounds that even time had not yet healed. After a conversation with the principal and a promise to address the issue at home, David took Liam out for ice cream, hoping to ease the tension. They sat on a bench, the silence between them heavy. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Liam," David said quietly. "I know I've made mistakes that hurt you and your mom. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Liam looked up at him, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and defiance. "But why did you leave, Dad? Why weren't we enough?" The question struck David to his core. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Back then, I thought I needed success to be happy. I thought that money and power would make me feel complete. But I was wrong, Liam. I was wrong to leave, and I'm so sorry for the hurt I caused." Liam's face softened, though a hint of sadness remained in his eyes. I just don't want you to leave again." David reached over, wrapping an arm around his son's shoulders. "I won't, Liam. I promise. You, your mom, and your siblings. You're my family. You're all that matters to me." In that moment, David realized the true cost of returning to his old life. It wasn't just about him. It was about the people who depended on him, who needed him to be present. He couldn't go back to the man he once was, not if it meant risking the family he had fought so hard to regain. The next morning, David called Charles. The temptation to return to his company had faded, replaced by a clarity he hadn't felt in years. "Charles, I appreciate the offer," he said, his voice steady. "But I have to decline. I've made commitments to my family, and I'm not willing to jeopardize that." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a resigned sigh. "I understand, David. You'll be missed, but I respect your decision." As David hung up, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had made his choice, one that was grounded not in ambition, but in love and responsibility. It was a path that required sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice he was finally willing to make. The weeks that followed were filled with a new kind of fulfillment. David threw himself into his role as a father, savoring every moment with his children. He found a part-time position with a nonprofit organization, helping young entrepreneurs build businesses of their own. The work was modest, but it filled him with a sense of purpose that his old life had never provided. One evening, as he helped Elise put the children to bed, he lingered in the doorway, watching as she read a bedtime story to Ava. Her voice was soft, soothing, and he was struck by the quiet strength she radiated. After the story ended, Elise turned to him, a small smile on her lips. "You've really changed, David," she said, her tone warm. "I didn't know if it was possible, but you've proven me wrong." He returned her smile, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Elise. I wouldn't have made it this far without you." They stood in silence, a comfortable stillness settling between them. For the first time, David felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that the past was no longer a burden. They were building something new, something grounded in trust and forgiveness. As he left her home that night, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had chosen his family over ambition, love over wealth. And while the road ahead remained uncertain, he was ready to face it, knowing that he had finally found what truly mattered. A new beginning. Winter had arrived, wrapping the city in a quiet, reflective stillness. For David, this season of change felt especially poignant, marking nearly a year since he had returned to his family's life. Gone was the man who had once chased wealth and status. In his place stood someone he barely recognized, but who felt more himself than ever before. The relationship he had rebuilt with his children was a constant source of joy. Each day, they grew more comfortable with him, no longer looking at him with uncertainty but with trust and love. Their laughter filled his modest apartment, turning the sparse rooms into a home. And while his life was simpler now, it was richer than anything he had known. He had given up a life of luxury, yet what he had gained was priceless. One evening, just a few days before Christmas, David was at Elisa's house helping her decorate. The children were asleep, and the soft glow of string lights wrapped around the tree filled the room with warmth. David reached for an ornament, handing it to Elise, who smiled as she carefully placed it on a branch. "Remember that one?" she asked, gesturing to an old, slightly faded ornament with their initials engraved. It had been a gift from their first Christmas together, a memento of the simpler days before fortune had overshadowed their love. He nodded, his heart swelling with nostalgia. "I do. We were so young back then, so hopeful." Elise chuckled, shaking her head. "We had nothing but each other, but we were happy." "Nay." "Oh." David looked down, the weight of his past choices pressing down on him. "Elise, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I wish I could take it all back, the years I left you to carry everything alone." She looked at him, her eyes softening. "David, I forgave you a long time ago. Holding on to anger would have only hurt me more. You were lost, caught up in a life that promised everything but gave nothing. I see that now." He was silent, humbled by her strength and grace. She had not only raised their children alone, but had managed to forgive him when he had given her every reason not to. They continued decorating, the silence between them comforting. Finally, Elise spoke, her voice thoughtful. "You know, David, you've changed more than I ever thought possible. The kids adored you, and you've given them a part of yourself I didn't think was there anymore." He looked at her, hope flickering in his chest. Do you think we could ever be more than just co-parents?" Elise was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the tree. "David, I'll be honest. It's taken a long time to heal from what happened. But I see how much you love them, how dedicated you've become, and that means a lot to me." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm not saying it'll be easy, but maybe we could take things slowly." His heart soared, though he fought to keep his emotions in check. He had been given a second chance, a fragile, tentative one, but a chance nonetheless. He nodded, a small, hopeful smile on his lips. "I'd like that. One step at a time." Christmas morning arrived with the sound of excited little feet pattering down the hallway. David had spent the night on Elisa's couch, wanting to be there for the children's first Christmas together as a family. The living room was filled with gifts, and the children's eyes sparkled as they tore through wrapping paper, squealing with joy at each present. But the true gift that morning was the sense of family that filled the room. David watched, his heart swelling with gratitude as he saw the joy on his children's faces and the warmth in Elise's smile. They were a family again, not perfect, but whole. After the children had unwrapped their presents, David pulled a small box from his pocket, holding it out to Elise. She looked at him in surprise, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Merry Christmas," he said softly, handing her the box. She opened it, revealing a delicate bracelet adorned with small, intertwined charms, one for each of their children, with their initials engraved. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. "David, it's beautiful," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. He smiled, his own eyes misting over. "I wanted to give you something meaningful, something to remind you of the family you held together. You were the one who kept them safe, who never gave up." Elise looked at him, her expression softening. She reached over, taking his hand in hers. "Thank you, David, for everything, for coming back, for choosing them, for choosing us." They sat together in quiet contentment, watching as the children played, their laughter filling the room. David felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a feeling that all was finally right in his world. As the months passed, David continued to rebuild his life around his family. He dedicated his weekends to spending time with his children, becoming the father he had once dreamed of being. His work with the nonprofit grew fulfilling, as he mentored young entrepreneurs, guiding them not just toward success, but toward lives grounded in purpose and integrity. He had found a new kind of success, one that wasn't measured by wealth, but by the impact he had on those around him. And with Elise, their relationship blossomed slowly, built on trust and mutual respect. They took long walks, spent quiet evenings talking, and found joy in the simple act of sharing their lives once again. There were no grand gestures, no promises of a perfect future, but there was love, and for David, that was enough. One evening, as David tucked his youngest daughter into bed, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with sleepy wonder. "Daddy," she whispered, "are you going to be here forever?" David smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm here to stay." Her eyes drifted shut, and David watched her, a surge of gratitude filling his chest. He had been given a second chance, a chance to right his wrongs and rebuild the life he had once lost. And though the journey had been difficult, filled with pain and regret, he knew he wouldn't trade it for anything. As he left her room, he found Elise waiting for him in the hallway. She smiled, slipping her hand into his. They walked together, their footsteps quiet, their hearts content. They had come full circle, rediscovering a love that had endured despite everything. For David, the life he had now was one of quiet fulfillment, of family and purpose, of love and redemption. He had chosen a new path, one that wasn't easy, but that had led him to a place of peace and joy he had never known. As they stood together in the stillness of their home, he looked at Elise, his heart swelling with a gratitude he could hardly express. He was no longer the man he once was, and for that he was profoundly grateful. In that moment, he knew he had finally found his way home.